All right, good morning. Good morning, both my students in my class, Political Philosophy and Higher Education, which is our normal class time, and hence the reason for maybe a slightly unusual Zoom meeting time of 9:30 in the morning. But this group of students have been reading a wide array of works in the history of political philosophy that touch on the theme of education, the purpose and the end of education. And as we approach the end of our semester, I could think of no better both book and conversation to have than with Anthony Kronman of Yale Law School, whose 2007 book, Education's End: Why Our Colleges and Universities have given up on the meaning of life, remains in my mind one of the most compelling, challenging, interesting, and I think stimulating discussions of the purpose and end of education. It's a book I've been teaching regularly in versions of this class since its publication in 2007, and one that I think has just simply, as my experience with this group of students attests, has never failed to stimulate really interesting, probing, and I think very rewarding conversations. For many years, I've been hoping to get Professor Kronman to campus to talk with a group of my students about this book. And in the age of pandemic, this has proven to be both easier, but also not quite the encounter and meeting that I'd hoped for. So I hope that this is just a promissory note to a future visit to our campus, Tony. Tony Kronman is the Sterling Professor of Law at Yale University Law School. He is a former dean of the law school and teaches in the areas of bankruptcy, contracts, jurisprudence, social theory, and professional responsibility. And in addition to the courses that Professor Kronman teaches at the law school, he also teaches undergraduate classes in literature, philosophy, history, and politics as part of the directed studies program at Yale. And for those of you with Notre Dame connections, this is a program that is not unlike the curriculum with the PLS program in liberal studies, a kind of great books focused program. And I think really speaks to the kinds of themes that Professor Kronman discusses in his book. Among the books he's published then is the book we're discussing today, Education's End, but also Max Weber, Contracts, Cases and Materials, Lost Lawyer, a book I hadn't been familiar with, but I want to read now. Maybe we'll find Professor Garnett, who's I know is tuned in, Lost Lawyer, and his latest book, Confessions of a Born-Again Pagan, which was published with the Yale University Press in 2016. Professor Kronman received his BA from Williams College and his PhD and JD, PhD in philosophy JD from Yale University, where he now hangs his hat. Professor Kronman, thank you for joining us virtually today. And what we'd like to do is begin with just giving you the opportunity to talk a little bit about the book. Our students have read the book, but for those who may not have read it, just to provide a summary, and then we'll hope to have ample time for questions, conversation, and discussion with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick, for the warm introduction. Of course, I wish I could be there in person. I've learned to live with Zoom as a second best. But I'm thrilled to be with you this morning, even if only virtually. I'm grateful to all of you in the class for spending the time with my book and with my ideas. It's immensely flattering, and I'm eager to hear your thoughts and reactions and criticisms. Of course, one of the advantages of a virtual interaction like this is that if you disagree so violently that you decide you want to throw something at me, you'd have to heave it about 1,000 miles east to hit me here on the little island off the New England shore where I'm sitting at the moment. I thought I might begin in a very brief and summary way by mentioning two of the great and lasting pleasures that I have experienced over the course of my life as a student and teacher in the pursuit of humanistic studies, and then briefly identify two of what I believe are the principal threats to study of this kind. One I emphasize in the 2007 book, which you've read. Another is front and center in a new book I published a year and a half ago called The Assault on American Excellence. And I'll explain a bit more in a minute. And I'll try to keep all of this brief, under 10 minutes, so that we can reserve the lion's share of our time for a back and forth. The pleasures of humanistic study. From the moment that I first began to dimly think about where I fit in to the larger scheme of things, I realized that I was a participant in an adventure that had been underway for a very, very long time before I came into it. First, as an American, and then secondly, even more broadly, as a late-born child in the civilization of the West, which stretches back not just centuries, but millennia in time. And I became curious to know where I fit in to this long-running film. What position as a latecomer do I occupy? What were the struggles and contests that had preceded me? I wanted to have a better idea of the civilization into which it was my fate to have been born. And the humanities, philosophy, literature, the classics, history, these have helped me over the course of a lifetime, really, to a better, richer understanding of the tradition that I have inherited. Not a perfect understanding. There are so many blank spots for me still, but the joy of humanistic study for me has been, in part, the joy of discovering where I fit into this larger and long-standing tradition of action and thought. That has sharpened my own understanding of what my responsibilities are looking ahead as a temporary custodian of this tradition, to see that it is carried forward in the best and most responsible way, and what my duties looking backward are toward the past. I might call that my obligation of piety to those who have come before, to see that their work was not in vain. So that's been one of the great pleasures of humanistic study for me, discovering my civilization, what it has been and what it might be. The second is a deepening acquaintance with what, for lack of a better phrase, I might call the human condition. Every discipline of study, physics, economics, biology, history, philosophy, is a product of human thought and achievement. They are all human works. But the humanities put a special focus, a spotlight on the human condition itself in a way these other disciplines do not, or do not to the same degree. In the humanities, the question is always, what does it mean to be a human being? To inhabit the human condition. There is no single definitive answer to that, but the question lies at the heart of humanistic study and is distinctive of it. In pursuing it, I have come again and again and again into contact, communication with thinkers and voices and ideas from the long dead past who have been as perplexed by their human being as I am by mine. And I have listened to what they have had to say, and my own sense of what it means to be human at all has been enriched and deepened by that encounter. That for me has been a second continuing pleasure of ongoing discovery, the enrichment of my sense of the human thing, of the human situation or the human condition, which is the perennial topic of all humanistic work in all of the different disciplines that I've mentioned. Okay, let me shift now from pleasures to threats. I've described in a somewhat personal way, perhaps, the experiences that have been for me the most important in my own course of humanistic study. What are the threats that I perceive to this pursuit? Well, there are two. The first I discuss at some length in Education's End, and it arises from the introduction and growing influence of an educational model that first took hold in American colleges and universities in the latter part of the 19th century. With the importation of the originally German model of research science, the idea took hold and acquired increasing legitimacy and prestige, that the first and most important responsibility of academics, of teachers in colleges and universities, is to advance knowledge in their particular disciplines by adding their small bit to an ever-growing pile of insight, discovery, and criticism. And this has been, of course, a very fruitful model. It has contributed to the production of the enormous bodies of learning in every discipline across the board in the world of higher education. It puts the emphasis on novelty, on originality, and it emphasizes the importance of a specialized division of labor in which each academic is left to cultivate his or her own small portion of the vineyard. If you believe that the primary responsibility of a college or university teacher is to produce and publish valuable research, specialization follows almost inevitably as a requirement. This ideal, the research ideal, has of course taken hold in the humanities as it has in every other discipline. But to the extent it has eclipsed, it has put in a shadow of declining importance and value the conception of humanistic study that I began by describing a few minutes ago. The idea that the student engaged in such reading and reflection is meant to come to a deeper, fuller understanding of his or her civilization and of the human condition more generally. That remains true to a degree, but in the humanities, it is overshadowed by this other research-oriented conception of the value of humanistic work. And with the growing authority of the research ideal, older notions of refinement, cultivation, the deepening of one's character, soul, if I may use an old-fashioned and highly charged word, these ideas have fallen out of fashion and perhaps even become a little suspect or disreputable. And that, I think, is a shame, because it casts in doubt all of the things, most of the things, that I have found to be of greatest value in my own encounter with the humanities over 50 years of time. Second thread, and this is the last thing I'll say before breaking off. I emphasize this less in education's end than I do in the assault on American excellence. The second threat is the politicization of higher education across the board, which today is proceeding with the force and speed of a hurricane. We are all being drafted into a political program. It is increasingly difficult to think of our colleges and universities as anything but adjuncts to a partisan political program motivated by a perfectly legitimate, respectable interest in promoting the fairness and justice of our existing political and social institutions. But this program today refuses to let higher education alone. It penetrates every nook and cranny of study. It has had a particularly dramatic effect on the humanities, which are vulnerable because they have to do with judgment, with values, with politics, and they are ripe for political expropriation and takeover. This wave of evangelical politicizing is today threatening to transform the humanities out of all recognition, the classics, history, philosophy, and to render completely indefensible the old-fashioned idea that studying the humanities is valuable for its own sake as a form of refinement, of cultivation, of soul development, and to depreciate that notion and make it politically suspect. So anyway, that is today, I think, the principal danger that those of us who care about the enduring perennial value of the humanities need to resist. Though I think even if we are able to fight it back, the dangers posed by specialization and the research ideal, which in some ways strike deeper, will remain and have to be addressed. Well, I've gone on longer than I meant to. I've said more than I intended. I apologize for that. I will just stop at this point, and we can devote the rest of our time together to a conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Professor Kronman. Thank you so much. And as you doubtless know from your teaching, the hardest question is the first question. After the first question is asked, there will be a flood, I know. So let me see if anyone is early in the morning. And if not, I will call on someone. Okay, Jonathan, why don't you come up here? Microphone. And I guess you're looking at that camera. Just introduce yourself briefly.
Thank you again for taking the time. My name's Jonathan.
There
you go. So you probably hear me better now. Thank you again for taking the time. My name is Jonathan Bullis. I'm actually a graduate business student, but taking this course because I'm interested in the topic. And I'm somewhat insecure about this question, so I'm going to admittedly hedge a little bit as I ask it. But I had a thought that kind of has come up a lot of times in reading books that explore similar topic, and my mask is about to rip, I can hear it right now, but that the emphasis of kind of the need for personal formulation and the lack of moral order in the beginning of the book is the end of the of where we are right now with education, not a predictable outcome of that, that if we allow, or is the Western canon so profound that truly explored it leads to a true exploration of the meaning life as opposed to a reductionist view of it as, whatever the research ideal is.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. I do think that a thoughtful engagement with the classical works that are generally thought of as forming the canon of Western literary and philosophical studies. I think that a thoughtful encounter with these books, beginning with the Greeks and the Romans, cannot help but stir in the student, or the teacher for that matter, who may be reading them for the nth time, questions of an intensely personal kind about how one wishes or chooses to live. What does one want to make of that very precious resource that we call a lifetime? There's a passage, I quoted, I think, in Education's End, a passage in Plato's Republic that made a very profound impression on me when I read it for the first time many years ago. Socrates and his students are discussing a very abstract philosophical question about the nature of justice. And one of the young men with whom Socrates is conversing says, Socrates, this seems like a very important subject, a very serious one. And Socrates turns to his interlocutor and says, indeed, it is a serious question. It is the question of how to live. And all of the books that make up the Western canon put this question to the reader in one form or another, some more directly than others. But you can't read Hobbes, Montaigne, Kierkegaard, Augustine, Kant, on and on and on, Tolstoy, Virgil. You can't read any of them without coming to this question. So the text always leads back to the reader, and the question that it puts to the reader is one that forces introspection and a more thoughtful and responsible engagement with the question of what to make of the precious resource of life that we've been given and that doesn't last forever. We need to do our best to figure out how to spend it or use it or enjoy it. And that question never goes out of fashion. How could it? As long as there are human beings, that question will be at the very center of any intelligent and reflective encounter with the human condition itself. To the extent the research ideal puts that question off to the side, it doesn't deny its existence, but it depreciates it. It puts it out of the spotlight. It makes it a question to be answered not in the classroom, but in the privacy of one's own apartment after hours. And that, to me, that view deprives the student of the opportunity to consider in a conversational forum with others wrestling with the same question what this text means and where it leads so far as the question of the meaning of life is concerned.
Hello, Professor. My name is Keegan. I'm a business student here. So sorry about this. This question's a tad long, but so in religion, there is some sort of regulatory influence within Christianity. It's Bible, church, some kind of external moral order.
I'm having a hard time hearing. Could you increase the volume a little bit? The volume.
Can I repeat the question? All right.
Yes.
Okay. So in religion, there is some sort of regulatory influence, specifically with Christianity, it's the Bible or the church. And in your book, you praise secular humanism as essentially necessary within a pluralistic society to go back to this better understanding of the humanities. However, by atomizing the search for truth, which it seems that secular humanism seems to do, it tends to value it. So my question is, does secular humanism have some sort of standard with which it can kind of prevent the, I guess, political correctness or research ideal from kind of seeping into it?
Yeah. Well, that's a challenging question, and might lead us in any one of a number of different directions. Let me start with the following observation. The great religious traditions, as we know them and think about them, share in common, underneath their diversity of approaches, beliefs, institutions, a fundamental preoccupation. And I would describe that in the following way. Every religious teaching offers instruction about the relationship between time and eternity. We live in time, we are mortal beings. We know that our lives will come to an end. The knowledge that we will die separates us in the most radical way conceivable from our beloved animal friends who are mortal like us but don't die. But don't know that they will die. And that knowledge itself, the knowledge of our mortality, arouses in every human being the question, what is the relationship between my life, which doesn't last, and a world or a God or something that lasts forever? Christianity answers that question. Judaism, Islam answer it too. So does Buddhism. The secular humanist is preoccupied with that very same question too. That question properly lies at the center of humanistic studies, just as it does at the heart of every religious tradition. The difference is that within a religious tradition, the followers, the believers, the adherents take certain fundamental premises as fixed. They start from an agreed point of belief and work out a view of the relationship between time and eternity from that perspective. Humanistic education, as I think about it, addresses the same question. How is time related to eternity? How is my mortality related to immortality? What is immortality? What does it mean? What form does it take? Humanistic inquiry addresses the same question, but without any fixed starting points of shared belief or conviction. So in a way, it's freer than every religious tradition, and yet in another respect resembles them in its preoccupation with the same orienting question or inquiry. I might, if I were asked to describe in a very summary way what the organizing theme of the directed studies program in which I teach at Yale is, I might say, it is an exploration of the variety of ways in which great thinkers, some religious, some not, over centuries of time in the West have conceived the relationship between time and eternity, mortality and immortality, and the program is meant to give the students in it so many different options for thinking about this relationship, while at the same time riveting their attention on the question itself and making it emphatically clear that you cannot live a meaningful, rich, thoughtful human life without attending to the question of the relationship between time and eternity.
I'd like to offer the opportunity for those who are viewing online. If you would like to pose a question after we get a few more questions from our students, why don't you indicate that maybe in the chat box? I would ask that, I hope that you ask a question on the basis of your reading of Professor Kronman's book. That would help for us. Next is Maggie Garnett.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor. My name is Maggie Garnett, and I might out my objection by saying I'm a theology major here. I guess I'm wondering, in your chapter on secular humanism, you talk about this idea that there's a decline of doctrinal or dogmatic tradition that left the world trying to grapple with the question of meaning without the presence of God. And I'm wondering if you think that is progress, that sort of dogmatic traditions are holding less weight, or if it's kind of creating this crisis or a hole that needs to be filled by a secular humanist tradition. And if so, how does secular humanism become something distinct from religion rather than just religion under a different name?
Yes, good. Okay, thank you, Maggie. Every American college, well, nearly every American college, was for a very long time not just an educational institution, but a religious one as well. Its program of study was embedded within a set of shared and unquestioned beliefs about the truths of religion, and the point or purpose of the program was to secure the students in their religious beliefs, to ground those and strengthen them, and to reaffirm in that way the specific dogmatic premises of the tradition to which the students and faculty belonged. In virtually every case, a Christian tradition. When the theological underpinnings of the old-time American college weakened, and the educational program that had once rested on those underpinnings was set loose, a question arose that hadn't existed before. What is humanistic study for if it's not to confirm the student in his or her Christian belief? If it's been set loose from that, what is its purpose or aim? And as I've come to see it, the purpose of humanistic learning is to deepen the student's engagement with a question that is religious in character after the older religious answers to that question had lost their claim to authority. I can put it in a slightly different way. In the old-time college, a question was asked and answered within a framework of accepted belief. That's what I mean by dogmatic. When the framework ceased to be accepted as a norm, a set of norms that was simply taken for granted, the questions didn't disappear, but the older answers to them would no longer do. So humanistic education, the tradition of secular humanism, as I call it in the book, is an attempt to find a new answer to a question that has survived after the older answer has lost its credibility. But the question retains its, if I can put it this way, the question continues to sound, to reverberate in a religious register insofar as it is centered on the relationship between time and eternity, between mortality and immortality. I can think of no more fundamentally religious question than that. But even after the specifically religious answers to it have been bracketed or put aside or converted into personal beliefs, the question remains worthy of collective study in an educational setting. And it is at the organizing center of secular humanism as I understand it. So, Maggie, if I could just add one more note, this view puts me in an uncomfortable position between my orthodox friends to one side, by which I mean my many friends who subscribe wholeheartedly to one religious tradition or another, and they see my secular humanism as a weak and unsatisfying substitute for a need that only religion can authentically provide, an attempt to fill a gap that can't be filled except in a more straightforwardly religious fashion. So they don't like the idea. And then my secular friends, my thoroughgoing secular friends say, you're just you're importing a religious preoccupation under another label. And I don't like that. I want to get religion out of the picture altogether. So I find myself awkwardly stranded in the middle between believers on the one hand and the radical naysayers on the other, trying to maintain the importance, to affirm the importance of a question, while at the same time denying the authority of the answers that established religious traditions give to it. Within a program of humanistic study in a college or university that does not itself have a direct and deliberate sectarian mission, as some of course do.
Take advantage of my role as professor of this class. It ought not to surprise you that you're receiving a few questions from some of our students about, in particular, the argument of your book relating to secular humanism as in some ways the ideal moment in the history of American higher education, as you describe it, roughly between the beginning of the 20th century, the early 20th century, until maybe the 1960s, 1970s, when you see the rise and the beginning of the domination of the research ideal, closely followed by the period you describe as political correctness, those two threats to higher education. And it wouldn't be surprising then for students at a place like Notre Dame, which remains, by your telling, still defined by the ethos of the first period of American higher education, the age of piety, that you describe, and I think you've reiterated today, as an age in which there's a kind of dogmatism, a kind of single-minded and static view of religious belief and faith, in which students' heads are opened and doctrine is poured in and then sealed up tight, that there was probably a bit of a pushback toward that view. From within this institution, I would say we have an extremely robust and deep and profound encounter with the question of the meaning of life, precisely because we're a Catholic institution. And this kind of static view of religious belief that you present in your book about the age of piety really doesn't, it seems to me, grapple with the fact that religious traditions like this one, and I think most, I dare say all religious traditions, have a whole set of internal questions that make the question of the meaning of life and the meaning of the afterlife, that temporal horizon you describe, in a way inescapable. So let me present you with an alternative telling of your story, which begins not with the founding of America and the founding of Harvard University as the beginning of the age of piety, but begins with the founding of the very first universities in Europe, the University of Paris, the University of Bologna. In other words, you have at least 1,000 years, if not more, of higher education that you describe as the age of piety that stretches far back. You mentioned Oxford and Cambridge as the models of Harvard and Yale, that there's a very long and ancient tradition. And then you have a very brief moment that you describe as the age of secular humanism, in which the effort collectively to search for the meaning of life in a way that's defined by a community of fellow seekers, in which we attempt to understand what the meaning of life is that we share and that we can share as a community of human beings, becomes individualized, as you describe it. And I think that's what attracts you to the age of secular humanism. Each person gets to define the meaning of life for themselves. But this becomes an extremely unstable moment, precisely because the meaning of life is not merely an individual pursuit, of course. It's something that, it seems to me, has to touch on our relationships to other people in a community of fellow seekers. And so it's not surprising that this really becomes a transitional period to precisely those two crises that you mentioned today, both of which in some ways arise from the individualistic nature of the age of secular humanism. They both have to do with the desire to advance human power, the power over the natural world, especially through the STEM disciplines, the ideal of the research university to afford us the ability to control the natural world, and of course the power that we see in the rise of political correctness, the effort, I think, especially to assert a kind of power through the, a kind of ideal of what identity is, of what the claims of our specific identity is against other identities. In other words, that we're increasingly a kind of tribal institution defined by the assertion of power, a kind of Nietzschean institution. So the story I would tell would actually track your story, but lead to a very different conclusion, that what you see as the ideal, in fact, was a kind of unstable transitional moment that was destined not to last very long. And that we should really be looking to institutions like Notre Dame as places that still preserve the deepest values that you seem to affirm, but that you, it seems to me, insufficiently recognize, precisely because I think you have a too static view of what piety, faith, and religion is. So perhaps a long question, but one that I hope provides some opportunity for exchange.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. It's actually 3 or 4 different questions, and any one of which would be a wonderful subject for an hour's conversation or a lifetime's conversation. Let me just pick out a couple of themes and respond to them. In individualism, I am an individualist in one sense and not an individualist in another. The question of how one ought to live, of what makes for fulfillment and significance in a life well lived, this is a question that comes back to each of us in an excruciatingly personal way. I can't answer the question for you. You are the final decision maker in the sense that it will be up to you at the end of the day to save yourself or throw yourself away. It's not a collective decision, it's an individual decision. But I reject the idea, as I suspect you do too, that the decision I make is justified and validated merely by the fact that I make it. That I am entitled to say to you, I've chosen my way, you go choose yours. I really have no justification that I need to offer, and I have nothing to learn from what others have to teach me. And in particular, it is a path of isolation that I am following. It's not a collective or collaborative endeavor. Individualism in all of those senses, I emphatically reject. Second, maybe more importantly, I feel so much more at home in the company of faculty like you and students like yours than I do in most other institutions, because the questions that preoccupy me are alive and well. And I don't feel at all constrained in this conversation or others like it that I've had at other with faculty and students at other schools like Notre Dame. I don't feel at all constrained in expressing my views or inhibited in responding to what others say in reply. I feel so much more at home than I do in the arid world of utter disinterest in this question, which is the predominant mood or atmosphere on most American campuses today. Give me any day an environment in which people are grappling seriously with the question of the relationship of mortality to immortality, of time to eternity. There, at least, there is the soil on which to have a conversation. You touched on so many other things that I am tempted to go on, but I think I'll just stop there because I suspect there are others in the queue who want to get in.
Thank you very much. Patrick. Another Patrick. Welcome to the land of the Irish.
Yes. So this is a question which follows on, I think, the first thing you said, trying to figure out which camera to look at here, but also follows your discussion of constructivism at the end of the 4th chapter of Education's End, and specifically how constructivism under secular humanism has to navigate this sort of productive tension between the individual's choice of meaning of life or life path having to be individual, but also being accountable to some external ideal, but or having some sort of intrinsic value apart from the individuals making the choice. But the question here is a practical one. If you have a freshman undergraduate student who comes in and is interested in pursuing this manner of education, how do you expect, realistically, such a student to make those initial judgments about the kinds of life paths that have intrinsic value or don't prior to, but necessarily prior to, their engagement with the secular humanist ideal? And if, like me, you think it's most likely that they will make these judgments, at least initial judgments, of what life plans have intrinsic value or not, based on initial religious presuppositions, does it then become the role of the professor under secular humanism to divest them of these pre-existing beliefs and notions?
Good. Thank you, Patrick. Divest puts it too strongly. Yes, of course, my Yale College students come in with all sorts of convictions and presuppositions about what's good and true and worthy. And excuse me, we read together texts that put these convictions, or some of them at least, in question. And the process of learning is one of mutual adjustment. My students don't come in as blank sheets and then learn about life by reading Plato and Aristotle and Augustine and Descartes. Their beliefs are hopefully challenged, refined, cultivated by their engagement with these texts, which is shaped from the very beginning by these presuppositions themselves. So there's a back and forth process of mutual adjustment. And at the end of the day, some convictions may be abandoned completely. More often, they are subtly refined and deepened. They become richer in the process. I would think it presumptuous of me as a teacher to ever tell a student, or even to suggest that they should throw out whatever convictions they have brought with them as a 17 or 18-year-old to their first year in college. What right would I have to do that? But by the same token, as a teacher, when a student makes a statement in class, which rests on assumptions that are unstated, my responsibility as a teacher is to draw those assumptions out, to invite the student to put on display what the student is taking for granted, and to be willing to subject those assumptions to a charitable, friendly, but critical inspection in the classroom itself. And that's hard work for all involved. It's hard for the student, sometimes even to see what the presuppositions are. Harder still to allow them to be scrutinized in a public light. It's hard for the teacher to do this in a way that is respectful and inviting, and yet independent and critical. But out of that experience and the back and forth between the assumptions the student starts with and the texts the student encounters, comes something deeper and richer at the end of the experience. I'll give you just one example to illustrate this. An Orthodox Jew or Christian or Muslim, a reader, a 17 or 18-year-old, well-educated in his or her religious tradition, who's read Maimonides, who's read Aquinas, who's read Avicenna and Averroes, it comes to my class and reads Aristotle, maybe in a serious way for the first time. And they know that the religious tradition to which they belong has drawn deeply from the Aristotelian well. But I invite them to consider the possibility that Aristotle was right and that the world itself is eternal. The world itself is divine. It can't be placed within a religious framework that demotes the world to being the creature of an otherworldly God who is now the entire possessor of what is truly eternal and everlasting. I say, consider Aristotle's arguments for the eternity of the world. Do you think they're good ones or bad ones? And that's a dangerous experiment, intellectual experiment, for any Orthodox student to entertain, because Aristotle is apostasy. If you embrace Aristotle, if at the end of some period of reflection you say yes to Aristotle emphatically, you must say no to Aquinas and Maimonides and Averroes and Avicenna. That is as radical a decision as any religiously motivated and inspired student can ever be forced to make. There's a modest example of how coming with a set of deeply held convictions about the nature of the divine, one can be put to the test and come away perhaps with a deeper, richer understanding of Aquinas, with a view that affirms the success of the Thomistic program of reconciling Aristotelian paganism and biblical revelation, or rejecting the attempt as a noble but failed experiment and embracing paganism instead, as awful as that may sound. But wow, what a great adventure for any young person to undergo.
Thank you. Luke Thompson.
Hi. Oh, it is on. Okay. Okay. I think it's a testament to how great a conversation we have that most of the questions I've thought of were asked before I had the opportunity to come up here. But just as a kind of a follow-up to Professor Janine's question that kind of framed secular humanism as a transitional period, traditional form of education in between a more traditional religious-based education and the modern form that you say that you described. Given that the pressures that kind of led to secular humanism's demise from both inside and without the academy, the research ideal and the political correctness, given that these pressures are still here, is there any sort of ambient political conditions that could sustain secular humanism for a longer period of time, make it something more than a transitional period? Or is there something that needs to happen from outside the academy, or is there a specific strategy the academy must take to try to sustain secular humanism itself and resist the pressures from outside?
Yeah, well, the humanities. Thank you. The humanities are under enormous pressure these days to either conform to the research ideal or to permit themselves to be drafted into a program of political rectification and social justice. Humanistic study, in the way I conceive it and defend it in my book, is at risk today of disappearing almost entirely from the world of higher education, except in schools like Notre Dame, which are able to protect and preserve it precisely because of their enduring commitment to an older system. of religious belief, which gives humanistic study an anchor and helps it to weather the storm. I'm not, to be candid, I'm not terribly optimistic about the future so far as humanistic study is concerned. Everywhere I look, I see it in retreat. I was just a couple of weeks ago reading an exchange among distinguished classicists reacting to the challenge that has been brought to the whole field of classical studies by a group of classics professors who characterize the study of the Greek and Latin classics as nothing but Western colonial racist imperialism. And they want to either destroy the field or have it refashioned. And my heart just sank. What will become of classics in 20 years or 25 years? So, in my more pessimistic moments, I sometimes fear that I'm living in the end days so far as humanistic study is concerned. Programs like the Directed Studies program at Yale still survives. It's tolerated. No one is suggesting that it be dismantled. But it remains under scrutiny, under suspicion. Those of us who teach in the program are constantly on the defensive, having to justify what we do and how we do it. And I don't know how much longer this can continue, really. There will always be a few places where the humanities survive, but it may be only under the protective umbrella of religious institutions of higher learning that give it the oxygen it needs to breathe after that has ceased to be the case in secular colleges and universities. One other thing I would mention, this is really one of the main themes of the assault on American excellence, the political movement that today demands the internal reform of our colleges and universities is motivated above all else by a commitment to the principle of equality. Equality is a great thing, but it has a leveling impact. The humanities cannot do without the idea of excellence, distinction, refinement, cultivation of lives better and worse lived. And they are by their nature hierarchical and therefore vulnerable to attack in the name of the leveling program of equality that one sees everywhere on American campuses today. So if the humanities are on the defensive, it's in part because traditionally they have defended the idea of excellence in living. And that idea today is suspect to a degree it has never been before.
Tony, we have about 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to do, we have a couple of people from online who'd like to pose questions. Before we take those questions and you can offer us some final responses, I would like to thank the Program of Constitutional Studies, the Tocqueville Program, and the Program of Liberal Studies for sponsoring this event today. Obviously paying for your airfare, hotel, and restaurants was expensive, but nevertheless, they are possible today for you to come in and join us. So thank you to those sponsors and my colleague and friend, Professor Munoz in particular, Soren Hansen, who's handling the technical side here. So we'll go in the following order. Veronica Veronica Martinez would like to ask a question, and then another Garnett, perhaps known to you, Professor Rick Garnett from our law school, would also like to ask a question.
Hello. Hopefully you can hear me. Thank you so much. Okay, good. So thank you so much for this talk. It's been really interesting. You know, bouncing back on, I think, your last comment or part of the response you just gave. I wonder, so in your book on in your most recent book, you say college education is under attack from all sides, or the blurb says most college education is under attack from all sides these days. Most of the hand-wringing over free speech, safe zones, trigger warnings, and the babying of students has focused on the excesses of political correctness. And then you were talking about how you feel like you have to be defensive when you want to talk about why it's really important for certain classics within the humanities to be taught. But I wonder if there's not a bit of hypocrisy in that statement. So I would disagree with your suggestion that the move towards equality is a move towards leveling. And what I really think you mean by that is a decreasing and diminishment of standards and a move against excellence. I don't think you have to sacrifice excellence for equality. But I do think there is some sort of hypocrisy in the idea that you don't want one set of, you think that it's problematic for one set of discussions to occur and to be negotiated in certain ways. And then other sets of discussions, you're like, well, I don't really want to have that discussion. And so I wonder if there's a hypocrisy there. I also wonder, though, about your critique of the humanities, right? So, and your critique about political correctness. So I certainly agree with you that it is likely the case that that higher education in this country has shifted dramatically since the 1960s, when women and people of color started entering into higher education. But I think a more fundamental question is, what would those educational institutions that you're trying to harken back to have looked like if they had always allowed women and people of color to be a member of their organizations, right? Are you harkening back to a time that just isn't possible because we've embraced an understanding of what education should be to include women, to include people of color? And might the political correctness that you're concerned about actually just be a natural consequence of changing our educational institutions from those that only included white men to those that include a whole vast array of individuals with different perspectives and ideas? Thank you so much for being here.
Okay. Good. Thank you. Thank you. Well, the college that I went to more than 50 years ago was shamefully exclusionary. And it was worse on account of who it didn't welcome in as fully equal participants in the educational adventure. So I am all for throwing the doors open wide. Indeed, I'm enthusiastically in favor of taking affirmative steps to see that members of groups who historically have been excluded from the privileges and the opportunities of higher education be invited in. I'm an enthusiastic proponent of affirmative action if one means by that making special opportunities available to those who have been denied any opportunity in the past. What I am against is introducing a program of social and political equalization into the very substance and content of the educational program of the humanities itself. Here's where the rub comes. You know, there's no contradiction between saying our schools should be open to talented young people of every race, regardless of their gender, their sexual orientation, their ethnicity, anything else. Of course, that's true. And there's no obvious incompatibility between that and a commitment to excellence within most disciplines. Why should there be any tension between recognizing excellence in mathematics and economics and physics on the one hand, and throwing open the doors of our colleges and universities to all talented applicants on the other? No tension at all. But if one says by excellence, I mean not just how well you do on tests and other measures of performance that have some objective validity, but when we're talking about excellence in living, in the quality and richness and depth of your life, that to many sounds like the invocation of an old hierarchical norm that is antithetical to the principle of equality, the contemporary principle of equality itself. But I dispute that. I think equality should mean an equal chance to discover and participate in excellence in living. And excellence in living is distinctive by definition. It sets those who have achieved it, realized it, exhibit it, apart from those who haven't or have only to a lesser degree. But that sounds to many like a hateful kind of hierarchy and subordination, which they reject root and branch as incompatible with their morality of equality. I want to put the two together in the way that Tocqueville did. Tocqueville's name has been mentioned. He's the namesake for whom the program in which I'm appearing today, isn't it? Tocqueville believed. Tocqueville was a fan of American democracy and of the principle of equality on which it rested. He also believed deeply that the great danger of American democracy is its tendency to level out the distinction between what is great and fine and rare on the one hand, and what is banal and ordinary and coarse on the other, and thought that the greatest challenge of the coming centuries in American life would be to preserve some sense of the latter, of the rare and excellent, in an increasingly egalitarian civilization. How can you have your cake and eat it too? And his great book on America is devoted to that question. And he looked in particular to our colleges. There were no universities when he wrote, to our colleges as institutions for the protection and preservation of some notion of excellence in a world increasingly governed by the principle of strict equality. And I'm with Tocqueville. I see the problem in the light he did, and am drawn to the same kind of, how should I put it, remedial solution that attracted him 100 and however many years ago it was. So I'm with the Tocquevillian program in that regard. And then there's my friend Rick Garnett. Hello, Rick.
Hey, Tony. Thanks so much for being here. It's sure. Great. It's great to see you again, and I can vouch to all the students what a wonderful job you did as a teacher. Was it not that many years ago, I suppose, when you were standing
3 or 4. That's all.
Yeah, 3 or 4. This question's pretty pedestrian, so I apologize. But I just you made a kind of a quick reference a few minutes ago to perhaps being in the end times of humanistic studies, and I certainly hope we're not. I wonder if you have any thoughts that you could share, even if they're kind of just spitballing, but what is to be done? That is, what are some concrete things that institutions of higher education can do in the current context to try to reclaim, hold on to, invigorate, strengthen humanistic study and sort of to resist the compartmentalization or the kind of utilitarian focus of government-funded research and so on. Is there any practical things that you'd want to suggest to university administrators or legislators?
Modestly, let those programs which have survived the maelstrom, let them continue to exist and to flourish. and to chart their own countercultural path. Programs like directed studies. Leave it alone. Let it be. Give us the resources we need to hire faculty to teach in the program and to recruit students to it. But that's very modest, Rick. I think within the in increasingly constraining limitations of higher education today, it may be that the only path forward is one that starts afresh from outside this institutional framework all together. If there were a handful of billionaire donors who were as devoted to humanistic learning as I am and wanted to start a new college, a brand new college from scratch, well, I'd be interested in talking to them about how to do that and where to do it. It's a big challenge. You know, if you did it, would anybody, if you opened the shop, would anybody come? The schools which have become hopeless still maintain a huge amount of prestige, and applicants to Yale will come in enormous numbers just because it's Yale, regardless of the fact that its educational program has become hollow and empty. But why not give it a try? If a couple of schools of this kind could be created and acquire some national notoriety for the simple old-fashioned thing they were trying to do, it might have an effect. In any event, it would be awfully fun to try. So if there are any billionaires out there who share my convictions and want to see if we can make a go of it, you have my number. Give me a call. But short of that, I say to those of you at Notre Dame, keep on doing what you're doing. Wish us well, those of us who teach in the directed studies program at Yale, and there are a few others like it, and we will hold on to the saving remnants in the last of days.
Tony, thank you. I think that's something that we here at Notre Dame like to hear and need to hear, that we shouldn't just try to ape Yale University. That's probably not the direction to go. We need to be ourselves.
Don't do that. Don't do that, please.
And I think rousing hurrah from our students. Our students have had to leave a little bit because we're up against the hour, but thank you very much for joining us today. I think it was for us a great opportunity to speak with someone whose book has been a really meaningful part of our course. So we really appreciate it and hope that we can invite you or host you soon here on campus. And it sounds like, if things get really bad, maybe you should be talking to Professor Garnett about Notre Dame Law School. Thank you again for being here.
Well, if I could, Patrick, first I want to thank you for the opportunity. It's been a privilege. I've really enjoyed it. But if I could take 10 seconds and put in a plug for my next book, which will come out at the end of the year or early next year. It's called After Disbelief. And it returns to some of the themes of our discussion here. And I suspect that you and your colleagues and students may not like it, but you'll be hopefully provoked by it. And that's a book I would love to come to South Bend to discuss.
Okay, let's make a deal, and we'll have you here when we're back open again. And I look forward to the opportunity to meeting you in person. So thank you again for joining us.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to everybody who joined in. Thanks, everybody.